Okay, so let's wrap up our discussion of Plato and the theory of forms. So I won't do too much review since you probably just watched the video above, but hopefully you remember we already have perfect knowledge of objective truth. We have knowledge of the forms already, and we got it because our soul was up in the immaterial realm with the forms and contemplation of the forms, and then our appetitive part of the soul dragged us down, and our knowledge has been muddied up by knowledge and desires from the material world. Okay, so I told you that we can clear away this mud that's covering our knowledge, and we can come back to our full understanding of the forms, or at least very close to it. Excuse me. Right, we'll never be able to eliminate the desires of the body or the wants of the body, but we can minimize them. Right, we can clear away as much as we possibly can and get back to near perfect knowledge of objective truth of the forms. But you should be asking yourself the following question: how do we get back to this knowledge? Right? How do we clear away what's bad? How do we retain what's good? How do we sift through all of the information we have and just get back to our knowledge of the forms? And so here there are a few options, right? So here's where we get into the Meno, which hopefully you read this week. In the Meno, we get to see what Plato calls the process of recollection, right? So recollection is exactly what it sounds like, right? We're able to just recall this knowledge of the forms that we once had. But it's not like we can just sit there and will the good knowledge, the perfect knowledge of the forms to come out and will the bad desires of the body away. It's not just a matter of willing it. There's going to be confusion, right? We're going to have, say, 6 different ways we might define piety. And so we can't just will ourselves to pick out which one of those 6 is the proper one. So how does recollection work? Well, part of it just occurs through education, right? So by educating ourselves and those around us, we're able to sort of pick out. So let's take piety, for example, again. Say we have all these different definitions for piety. We're able to take those 6 definitions, and through education, we're able to see which ones are bad, right? So you can think of part of what Socrates was doing in the Euthyphro as this process of education, right? So he knows which definitions are bad already because he has all of this good reasoning, and he's able to tell us, okay, that definition's bad, that definition's bad, that definition's bad. And by clearing away all the bad ones, or a good number of the bad ones, we're left with fewer options for which one might be correct, right? So we're getting close to this process of elimination, and we can recollect which one of those is the correct one. It can also just happen through critical reflection. So like I said, you can't will it to exist, but you don't have to be educated by somebody else, right? You can sit there in critical reflection of your own ideas and see which ones don't hold up to scrutiny and see which ones do hold up to scrutiny. Okay, so both of these are exemplified in the Meno when Socrates is talking to the slave about geometry, geometric truths. Right, so we know from Meno's testimony that this slave has had absolutely no education in geometry, yet through simple discussion, right? So Socrates is educating this person and then asking the person to critically reflect on what Socrates is saying and critically reflect on his own thoughts. Right? So this mix of a little bit of education with critical reflection by the slave very quickly shows that the slave has some knowledge of geometry. And Socrates says, look, this is evidence that the slave already has this knowledge, that he's just recollecting the knowledge that he already has. because it wouldn't make sense to say that the slave is somehow learning this at the moment, right? He's never had any education in such things and yet is still spitting out some truths about geometry very quickly, just through a few questions from Socrates, right? So Socrates says this is evidence that recollection works, that we can recollect these facts, and that's good, right? So that gives us a clear process of how we can start to get knowledge of the forms. We have this knowledge already, and we can clear away the bad ones and find our way to the perfect knowledge through education and critical reflection, which are both part of recollection. Okay, good. So how else might we know the forms? Well, there's also the process of dialectic. And this is pretty much what we're seeing Socrates do in all of the dialogues, right? So Socrates is talking to Euthyphro about piety, and in doing so, he's trying to discover the nature of piety, and he's trying to discover the relations piety has to other things. And he's not doing this purely through education and critical reflection, right? He's doing this through discussion with another person and through very pointed questioning. And so when he's talking to Euthyphro, Socrates says, I know nothing about piety and I need your expertise to inform me. And so Euthyphro starts giving all of these different definitions, and Socrates starts saying, okay, well, this discussion is useful, right? Because you're giving me ideas that I hadn't yet thought of. But just turns out that you're giving me bad ideas, right? You're giving me bad definitions. But we wouldn't have ever known that if we didn't have this discussion. And by having this discussion and having somebody there to ask very pointed questions about the definitions being given, we can pick out which ones are bad. So once again, dialectic is another tool for letting us clear away what's bad or what's false or what's not the truth about the forms, and leaving what is true about the forms left in our knowledge. Okay, we can't get rid of the truth, right? So if we can clear away all the false stuff, we'll just be left with the truth. Okay, so dialectic, just to make this clear, is different from recollection because it's not really a process of education, right? Dialectic is taking two people or a group of people, right? At least two people who have some ideas about the topic at hand, and then through discussion and pointed questioning and debate, right, they're able to advance both of their knowledge bases, which is what happened in the Euthyphro, and as we saw, what happens also in the Meno as they're talking about virtue. So he shows, so that's a great example, right? In the Meno, you get the example of dialectic between Socrates and Meno, right, when they're talking about the essence of virtue, and then you get the process of recollection when Socrates is talking to the slave about geometry. Okay, and then the final way in which we can come to knowledge of the forms is through what Plato calls love and desire. And so this one's a little weird, but I don't think it's too hard to make sense of. So Plato thinks that we have this innate ability to recognize beauty in the world. And so we have this love of beauty, we have this desire for beauty, and it draws us to all of the beautiful things in the world, all of the particular objects. Right? So we start to, like I said before, we can have beautiful flowers, beautiful people, beautiful paintings, beautiful everything else. And we're experiencing all those particular things. And because we have this love and desire for beauty, we are naturally drawn to the abstract concept of beauty, right? So we experience the particular things, and then we just have this thought of beauty. And then we focus on that, and our love and desire drives our focus, and we end up understanding the essence of beauty, which is to understand the form of beauty. So there's a very sort of, because we have this love and desire for beauty, it quickly moves us through from the particular beautiful objects to sort of a vague understanding of beauty in general to the essence of beauty or the form of beauty. Okay, so now we've seen how our soul that's been muddied up with the bodily desires and beliefs of the world can get rid of most of those and come back to having full knowledge of the forms. And so, like I said, all three processes, but especially recollection and dialectic, are a good way to clear away all the bad stuff, right? So it might not point out the objective truth for us immediately, but it's like a process of elimination in that dialectic and recollection can help us get rid of the bad false beliefs, so we're left with fewer options for what the good or true belief might be. Okay, and so then finally, you might be wondering, well, why should I be on board with this in the first place, right? It's weird. It posits these immaterial forms that exist somewhere else that aren't maybe explained in enough detail. I have to believe in a soul in order to believe in this theory. So it's hard for me to get on board. How am I supposed to believe this? Well, there's two responses to this. And one is just to say, even if at the end of the lecture you don't end up believing Plato's theory of forms, it's important for you to see how this is at least one possible answer to how we could have objective truth. Right, so remember, that was our overall project. We have to pick out a way to solve Socrates' final step, right? How do we show that there can be objective truth, and how can we know it? Theory of forms gives us a perfect answer to that. There are multiple other answers we'll discuss as the semester goes on, but it's important to see how that answers the question, even if you're ultimately unsatisfied with it. Okay, so why else might you believe it? Well, one, it seems like our language implies it, right? So I've talked about concepts a lot. I've talked about abstracting away from particular things to the general things. So all the time when we're talking to one another, we're referencing abstract objects, right? So I can talk about, I have already, right? I've talked about chairs, I've talked about apples. And you know immediately what I'm talking about. How? Right? It's not like I'm holding an apple or showing you the chair I'm sitting in, so you don't have a particular reference point, right? So what the hell are we both referring to if we don't have the forms? Yeah, so you might think, okay, well, it's our concept. That's what our language is referring to, is just this concept. But what is that concept referring to, right? It's not referring to all the chairs in the world, because we don't know what all the chairs are. We haven't seen them all, so it can't be referring to all of them. So some have said this is good evidence for the theory of forms. We're just referring to the form. Second, we often make claims that things are imperfect. Right, so I often, when I'm teaching this class in person, have dry erase markers that are always dying on me. Right, those are imperfect dry erase markers. You can sit in a chair and it wobbles. You think that's an imperfect chair. And so once again, Plato wants to ask, what are we referring to? Right, there has to be some perfect version for us to make a claim that something is imperfect. Right? So if we're going to say this chair is imperfect, it's because we have some reference of what a perfect chair would be like. And Plato thinks that perfect thing can't possibly exist in the physical world, so we must be, again, referring to the forms. And then finally, we do something analogous to the reasoning of the forms in science. Right? We start looking at all the particular data and then abstract away to see the laws that govern everything, right? These very general laws. So that's just the third one, maybe not as strong of evidence, but it shows how we use this reasoning already in believing about abstract things like scientific laws. Okay, so that's it for the theory of forms. You know where the forms exist, that we need a soul in order for this theory to work. You know, through recollection, dialectic, and love desire, we can get back to our perfect knowledge we once had. And it seems like our language and reference to imperfect things gives us pretty good reason or evidence to believe in it, even if you're not on board with the existence of the soul. So hopefully everything's pretty clear to you now. If you still have any questions, feel free to email me. Thank you, everyone.